All right. We're going to get to your phone calls in a second. I want to read some of the reaction online to the question about the Journal News' decision to not only give those dots in the map to show where guns were owned, but they also gave it with the names and the identification of the homes. So you have a lot of people outraged. I want to give you a quick sample here, and this a little bit of a mix here. Antonio wrote, just glad I live in a state where we don't have to register our firearms or have a permit just to own one. Tennessee, in case you're wondering. James Durden wrote, not only do people now know where the legal guns are kept, but they have a good idea of what houses may only possess long guns or no guns. This reporter, newspaper, and editor have done nothing positive for this area. And from the other perspective, you have Scott who writes, sorry, but there's no invasion of privacy here, to speak to Andrew's point. These people in Dominic's applied for permits, and by law, those permits are public record, okay? You know, we were talking before, and I remember this paper's one of their biggest sellers was the performance of the high schools, how they did on the SATs, how they did on the other standardized tests comparable to the other schools, and how many kids graduated, all those generic, not generic, but specific metrics for the school. If I follow this thing, instead of saying for every town how many towns each gun had, they would have said, okay, well, little Johnny who lives on 3 Smith Lane in X town, and this is a picture of his house, he scored a 74 on the standardized test here, and he scored an 1100 on his SATs. Did it go beyond that? And maybe that's not the perfect analogy, but my point is, in specifying person, home, and address, did it invite unfair scrutiny?
Well, from a news gathering standpoint, once you decide to do the piece, I think you have to provide the information. You can't just say this is where all the guns are and not give names and addresses. You have to provide.
Why?
Because you could just be making it up wholly out of cloth.
But you could say that you have it and then have people come if they really want to see it
sure,
and view it privately.
That's not the way news works. I mean, news is
Right.
based.
We could have said, what if they said, in Pearl River, in Rockland County, the paper found that 73% of the households in that town, I'm making all these numbers up, were in households that owned a gun. Why wouldn't that have been just as efficient?
Every night on this show, we go through numbers from polls, or we go through numbers from what other matrix that we're looking at, and sometimes we get lost in the numbers. Numbers have a way of bleeding over onto each other, but when you look at the map that's on the board behind you, Rich, that's effective. That shows exactly how prevalent it is. It's right near you. You can't take a step in your county.
But you just made the point. The map tells the story.
Right.
So why do I need to know on what street?
Because
what's the picture of the house and what his name is?
In addition to the dots, otherwise you're just playing light bright.
I will say that. Let me add a little bit to
Good
this.
reference.
To your, I do like light bright. I'll add an interesting reference. My mother used to tell me, she taught in Jamaica before she came to the United States, that they would publish the results of standardized tests in the local newspapers. So you knew if your neighbor's kid did not do well on certain exams, which is an incredible amount of burden for me to carry as the son of a school teacher. But the point of it was to instill some kind of accountability, not just in the school system, but also in the community and in the families. If the point of this was to address some level of accountability, that's children, these are adults with legal handguns. If this is about instilling some level of accountability, I think you could do that, you could have accomplished that, not by putting a name and an address to the dot. Because what does the dot tell you? What does the dot tell you?
You, Andrew, have on this same program objected when they printed the names of Johns who went to prostitutes. Those guys broke the law, and you're upset that these guys' names are published. These people didn't break any laws. They're law-abiding residents, and now they're having their names in the paper being identified. So if a neighbor all of a sudden's got an issue with them, now what they did behind the doors of their own home.
There's a compelling interest in knowing if your neighbor has a gun. There's a compelling safety interest in play
Says who?
here. Says me, says you, says anybody.
Wait,
do you not want to know if your neighbor has a gun?
But
do you want to know?
Not if he's not breaking the law.
But you know what's happened? What's happened is that paper has now gone ahead of law. Because if that's the case, and I'm not saying that you're wrong in that, if I as a neighbor have a right to know if you, my neighbor, has any kind of gun, then I think the state law should address that, similar to the sex offender law.
It's an interesting question whether this should be part of the law, whether this information should be public and standardly so.
Let's keep this conversation going after the break here. We're going to start with Dom after that. Stay with us, everybody. Back after this.